Good morning again. The record will reflect the presence of counsel, the defendant, and the jury. Mr. Barker, you may call your next witness.
Thank you. State calls Lisa Peloza.
Do you solemnly swear, under penalty of perjury, the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
You may proceed, Mr. Barker.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
Can you state your name for the record and spell your last name, please?
Lisa Peloza, Peloza.
Thank you. Lisa, where do you work?
I'm currently employed with the Arizona Department of Public Safety at their Central Regional Crime Laboratory in Phoenix.
And what is your position there?
I am a forensic scientist.
How long have you been a forensic scientist there?
I've been with the Department of Public Safety for just over 22 years.
Before that, what did you do?
Prior to working with DPS, I was employed with the Illinois State Police Department at their Forensic Science Center in Chicago.
And what was your role there?
There I was also a forensic scientist specializing in the area of firearm identification.
Okay. Anything before that?
Prior to that, I worked for the Chicago Police Department for about a year, just under. However, that was in the drug chemistry section.
Okay. And tell us about your education.
I have a bachelor's degree from the University of Illinois at Chicago, and I've also completed the coursework toward a Master of Science in Forensic Science from the same university.
All right. But no degree yet on that?
Not at this time.
Okay. So give us an idea, how many years total have you been in the firearms identification section?
I've been in the field of firearms for, I believe it's 26 years, right around 26 years.
Right. And how many times have you testified in court as an expert in that field?
I've testified approximately 80 times. I believe they were all in firearms. If I'm confusing any with drug chemistry, there were only 3 of those. So close to or approximately 80 times in firearms identification.
Thank you. Do you have any specialized training with firearms identification?
I do. I received my training with the Illinois State Police Department. There, I successfully completed their formal training program in firearm identification, and that training included the reading of numerous books, journals, and other literature pertinent to firearm identification. I also had the opportunity to attend numerous lectures given by experienced examiners. During that training, I took many oral and written examinations. I was required to complete proficiency tests, and at the end of my training, I went through a period of supervised casework before I was signed off to do casework on my own, under my own name.
How often is this proficiency testing?
Proficiency testing, continuing on through the years, is minimally once a year.
All right. Have you, are you a part of any association related to firearm identification?
I am a member of the Association of Firearm and Tool Mark Examiners, commonly referred to as AFTE, and that's a group of people who are in the same discipline, working in the field. It's an international association, and I believe we've reached about 1,200 members at this point.
Right. And did you mention how long have you been with the AFTE group?
I applied for AFTE membership as soon as I was eligible for it. I think a safe estimate would be that I've been a member for about 23 or 24 years now.
Have you toured any facilities, any labs, or for firearm examination, other labs besides your own?
I have. I've had the opportunity to tour both the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI laboratory, as well as the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, ATF laboratories, both in the Washington, D.C. area. And through the course of the years, I've also had the opportunity to tour other laboratories throughout the country.
Have you visited any plants that make firearms or ammunition?
I have had the opportunity to visit numerous manufacturing plants for both firearms as well as ammunition manufacturers, and was described and shown the different processes of what is involved with the manufacturing of both firearms as well as the ammunition.
And does that help in your experience to identify firearms?
Yes, it does.
Right. Have you done any teaching in this field?
I have taught the portion of the firearm identification in the program that the Arizona State University offered, and unofficially I've done neighborhood type community lectures on the area of firearm identification. And several years ago I taught the firearm portion of the classes that were under a program referred to as the Forensic Science Academy. And that Forensic Science Academy, their goal was to help educate attorneys, both defense and prosecution, and other people in the field that would be helpful for them to learn more about forensic sciences.
So you mentioned you've testified around 80 times as an expert in this field, is that right?
Yes.
And in which courts have you testified?
I've testified in Cook County, Illinois, as well as Rock Island County, Illinois. In Arizona, I've testified in Maricopa, Mojave, Pinal, and Yuma counties. And I've also testified in federal court at the Western Division of New York. I believe I may have stated the name improperly, but the Western Court in New York, as well as federal court in Arizona.
Is this your first time in Coconino?
It is my first time testifying here, yes.
All right, welcome.
Thank you.
Tell the jury about your duties as a firearm examiner.
My primary duties are to receive evidence related to firearms. I examine that evidence. I render an opinion based on my examinations. I issue a report stating what my results are. And then when necessary and when asked to do so, I testify in court.
And how many, if you could estimate, how many firearm examinations have you done in your career?
Actual firearms, between the number that I've examined throughout training as well as doing casework, I'd have to say numerous thousands at least.
Okay. In all of your experience prior to this case, has any other firearm expert disagreed with your conclusions?
There is a case that hasn't gone to court yet, and what I do remember is the defense had a defense expert review my work, and what's sticking in my mind is he had misread a abbreviation in my notes, and that caused some confusion. Outside of that, I don't recall having another examiner disagree with results that I've had.
All right. Let's talk about the lab you work at. You said it's a DPS lab, crime lab. That's a state facility, right?
Yes.
And are there any quality assurances that are put in place there to make sure that everything's done orderly and in quality? Can you talk about that?
We do have many quality assurance things to follow, and we are actually accredited by ANAB, and if I remember correctly, that stands for ANSI, National Accreditation Board, and the ANSI portion of that is the American National Standardization Institute, I believe. More importantly, we are accredited by an organization that's reputable.
All right. And is the lab also audited from time to time?
Yes, we are.
And how often does that occur?
That happens on site every 4 years.
Now, when you make a conclusion, and we'll get to that in this case, but when you make a conclusion, is that verified by another examiner?
Not all conclusions are verified. However, identifications or eliminations based on individual characteristics must be verified by another examiner.
And explain how that works. How is it verified?
If I make an identification with various types of evidence, I record my result, and then I will have another examiner that's available to me in my laboratory look at my evidence, and that other examiner will decide with their opinion whether it is an identification or not. And then they will sign off on my worksheets. In the case of identification, they'll state that. If it is an elimination based on individual characteristics, then that would also need to be verified and signed off on my worksheet.
All right. You said a couple terms we'll define in
Yes.
a minute. Let me ask you still about the quality assurances. When you reach a conclusion, do you consult with the prosecutor before offering that report?
Typically, I don't consult with the prosecutor until after my work is completed and they've had a chance to review my results in my report. And then if there's any questions about what I did or how I came to that conclusion, then there may be discussion.
So you wouldn't give a preliminary conclusion before authoring your report, is that fair?
I am not allowed to give any conclusion to an investigator, officer, or attorney. The most I would be able to do is, after a verification, I may verbally give that information. However, the actual report and the entirety of the case would not be released until it's been properly reviewed and released.
And why is it important that you don't have that type of communication before everything's been verified and you create a report?
For me, it wouldn't matter if I had discussed anything with anyone prior. However, overall, my opinion is to remain based on the evidence that I'm looking at only. And I don't need to know typically any scenario that may have happened. On most cases, there are certain types of cases that involve distance determinations that I may need more information. However, with basic comparison cases, there's typically nothing that can be provided to me that would alter my opinion in one way or another. So besides the fact that it's part of our quality assurance measures, there's nothing I could gain to aid in my comparison work by speaking with someone during my analysis or prior.
And would that also reflect some type of bias if you were consulting to try to figure out what the conclusion should be?
I suppose that could appear as some kind of bias, and probably, generally speaking, would just not appear good, would not look good.
And in your experience, this is a science we're talking about. You want to just refer strictly to the evidence. Is that fair?
Yes.
Okay. Will you define for the jury what firearm identification is?
Firearms identification is just one of the disciplines of forensic science, and my primary concern is to determine whether a bullet, cartridge case, or other ammunition component was fired by a particular firearm. And firearms identification is actually one of the areas that falls under tool mark identification. And with firearms, the firearm is the tool that I'm examining.
All right. What do you base the identification on? What type of markings?
To make an identification, I first need to ensure that the class characteristics are the same from one item to the other. And then I need to ensure that the individual characteristics reproduce from one item to the other before I can make an identification.
Define class characteristics.
Class characteristics, when we're speaking of firearms, would be things like the caliber of the firearm, the shape of the firing pin, and the rifling that's in the barrel of that firearm.
All right. And then you mentioned individual characteristics. What does that refer to?
Those are the markings that are produced accidentally, unintentionally during the manufacturing process, and they could also be made during, if there's any rust to the firearm or tool, abuse, or any other mishandling like that. Over the course of time, individual characteristics can be instilled, I guess. I can't think of the proper word, into a tool that would make it more individual.
All right. And when you look at those class and individual characteristics, are you able to determine a unique firearm? In other words, can you distinguish between one rifle that is manufactured at the same plant from another rifle that's manufactured at the same plant?
If I can distinguish one rifle from another based on the individual characteristics, if that is your question, then yes, I can.
All right.
And may I add something?
Yes.
I stated that the individual characteristics are accidental and unintentional. Those class characteristics are determined by the manufacturer. So they decide what caliber I want this firearm to be and what shape the firing pin should be. So those are known characteristics that the manufacturer will decide upon.
All right. May I approach the witness, Judge? Are these demonstrative exhibits showing or helping to define class characteristics and individual characteristics?
Yes, they are.
All right. And would that help in explaining this to the jury?
I believe it would.
Move to admit 163 through 165.
Any objection?
No.
Exhibits 163, 164, and 165 are admitted.
Publish. So first 163, so we can understand a little bit the class characteristics. Now this is referring to some specific ways. Can you talk about that?
Yes. If you were to look down the barrel of a firearm, and I don't recommend that typically, you can see that those raised areas in that barrel that you're looking at, down the bore of the barrel, turn a certain direction. And if you were to use your hand and let your fingers follow that flow, on the left-hand side of that image, you're seeing what represents a left-hand twist. And on the right-hand side of the image, you're seeing what represents a right-hand twist. So when I speak of rifling, I would state the number of lands and grooves and then the direction of their twist.
Lands and grooves. So this is referring to class characteristics.
Yes.
Let's go to 164.
Here on the left-hand side of the image, you're seeing another diagram. If you were to be looking down the bore of the barrel, and you can see that the raised area is labeled as a land, and the lowered or indented area is a groove. When I don't have something visual, I like to explain them or describe them as hills and valleys. So the land would be the hill, and that groove would be the valley. And in this case, if you were to count, you would see 6 lands as well as 6 grooves, and they have the right-hand twist. So if someone were to ask me what's the rifling of this barrel, I would say 6 right. And then on the right-hand side of this image, questioned item, bullet. If this bullet had passed down, or if a bullet had passed down this barrel, you would see something similar to what you see in the image on the right-hand side. And in that light greenish color arrows that states groove impression, that is made by the groove of the bore of the barrel. So on the bullet, it is actually a raised area. It could be referred to as a bullet land, but more commonly and consistently, we refer to it as a groove impression. And the areas marked with yellow, we refer to as land impressions. And so those are actually grooves in the bullet. And again, for consistency, we refer to it as the land impression because the land of the barrel made that area impressed on that bullet as it traveled down.
These are class characteristics. So essentially, any bullet that was fired through that particular barrel would have the same class characteristics.
Yes, any bullet fired through that barrel will have rifling characteristics of 6 right.
And that could be all kinds of barrels that have that same configuration.
different manufacturers may use 6 right, or they may use something different, but 6 right is just a number of lands and grooves in the direction.
You talked about individual characteristics, and these are some examples, obviously not a.
It's easier to explain individual characteristics on tools of this sort. It's easier to explain and to see in the image. On the left-hand image, you have a peening hammer, or essentially just a hammer, and you can see maybe the roughness of the face of that, and that would be caused by anything that that tool had hit. So a nail, for instance, may leave a slight impression, or if that hammer is used improperly, it could be used and scraped along a sidewalk maybe, and different scratch marks will be left in there that weren't intended by the manufacturer. They were produced either accidentally or by misuse. On the right-hand side, I believe those are wire cutters. I may have the tool name wrong, but you can see that circled area in red. That would be an example of something that was used improperly. If this were used on a piece of metal that were stronger and tougher than the tool itself, then that piece of metal is going to mark what we would typically use as the tool. Again, as I said, it's easier to describe individual marks on tools such as this as opposed to the barrel of a firearm, but it's the same concept. Regular use or abuse or any corrosion, rust, or damage to any of those tools, including the firearm, would produce individual characteristics.
Another way of saying say unique characteristics?
Yes, you could say that.
Okay. And the tool we're talking about when you're talking about firearm examination is the actual firearm, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. So we've established or defined class characteristics and individual characteristics. What is the tool that you're using to identify these characteristics?
When I'm looking at fired evidence, I primarily use a comparison microscope.
And what is that?
Essentially, it's just 2 microscopes that sit side by side, and they're connected by an optical bridge, which allows me to view both microscopes simultaneously with the same degree of magnification. So I could have 2 individual items, and when I look through that optical bridge, I can see them side by side as though they were one item if I line them up properly.
And what are the items that you would be doing that with?
Most often it would be fired bullets or fired cartridge cases.
All right. Now, if I'm looking as an untrained person through a comparison microscope, am I going to see the same things that you're seeing?
I would not expect someone who's not familiar with the science or the practice of firearms identification to understand exactly what I'm looking at when I'm looking at those individual characteristics. So I think I'd have to say you would likely not see what I'm seeing.
Does experience matter?
Yes, it does.
More experience, the better in your profession?
I would say so, and I just recently thought of an analogy to explain that better. Prior to being released to do casework, I must take a competency test in addition to those proficiency tests that I take annually. And if you want to compare that to something we're probably all familiar with, when you get your driver's license, you need to take a test, a road test and a written test, and you need to prove that you're competent to operate a vehicle. And generally speaking, you know how to do that, and you can drive, and you're able to do that successfully. However, the more years you drive and the different surfaces you drive on, the different weather conditions, all those things that you experience in your driving span make you a better driver so that you understand different things, you're able to handle the vehicle better, you understand what could come at you as with surface of a road, or as I stated, the weather. So as time goes on, I would say the more you drive, the better you become. And just like with the microscope work, the more I see, the more I experience, the different types of things that I see, I believe make me a better examiner.
Now, do you take photos of these comparisons under the microscope?
For note-taking purposes, yes.
Do you ever make conclusions based on photos?
No, we don't make any type of conclusion based on photographs.
Why not?
Photographs are two-dimensional, whereas the items I'm looking at are three-dimensional. And when you're looking through the microscope, I'm only able to capture an image of a small area of what I'm looking at overall. So the field of view is limited, the depth of view is limited. If I'm looking, in the case of a fired bullet, it's a curved surface. So when I'm doing an examination, I can change the focus as I'm looking at it and make different areas in focus, and then instantly make a different area in focus so that I could see that curved surface almost all at the same time. When I capture an image, I can only focus on one area, and that really doesn't give the best representation of what I'm looking at through the microscope. So photographing what I'm looking at through this microscope just has numerous limitations that don't do what I'm looking at through the microscope justice, basically.
All right. Now, you talked about this a little bit, but let's get some more explanation. How does a bullet traveling through a gun pick up the characteristics that we're talking about, those tool characteristics?
When a firearm is fired, and I'm just going to describe a simple example of any firearm, you have a cartridge that you're going to load into the chamber, and the cartridge consists of the cartridge case, a powder charge, primer, and a projectile or bullet. When that cartridge is placed into the chamber, and then the firearm is in a locked manner, the hammer can be cocked, and when the trigger is pulled, that hammer is allowed to rotate forward, and that firing pin will strike the primer area of that cartridge. That detonates, and that causes a spark that will cause the powder charge to burn and burn rapidly, which is going to produce gases in every direction. And one of those directions would be at the base of the bullet or projectile, and that's what's going to push or force the bullet down the barrel. And at the same time, those gases are going sideways and rearward. That cartridge case will be pushed rearward against the breech face of the firearm, where it will pick up the markings from the firearm. And then the firearm continues its process of extraction and ejection. But basically, it's the powder charge that pushes and forces the bullet down the barrel. And as it travels down the barrel, it will have imparted upon it the characteristics of the barrel. And the cartridge case, as I stated, when it slams against the breech face, will have the markings of the gun impressed upon it as well.
So if I understood correctly, that bullet, as it's traveling through the barrel, it may pick up those imperfections and be scratched or grooved in such a way that you can identify that bullet as being fired from the gun. Is that right?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Let's talk about how you process or the process of an examination. Take us through the steps. What do you do first?
When I receive a case to work, I will get the evidence from our property and evidence section. I want to ensure that the evidence is in a sealed condition and I have the items that I'm supposed to examine. I will then fill out a standard worksheet. In the case of a firearm, I want to make note of the make, model, caliber of that firearm, the other characteristics. I'll make note of the safety features as well as any accessories that may have been submitted with that firearm. I will determine if the safety features function and then if it appears to be in proper working condition. If those things are yes answers, then I will test fire that firearm, and I will most often use laboratory ammunition, and I will use the magazine if it were submitted with the firearm, and test fire that firearm into our bullet recovery system, which is essentially just a large metal tank filled with water. And I do that so that I can get the fired bullet from that gun in a relatively undamaged way so that the only markings on that bullet will be from the firearm. And I also collect the cartridge cases, and I can use those for further examination if necessary. When I receive fired evidence, again, I'll use our standard fired bullet or cartridge case worksheet. I'll make note, of course, that things arrived in a sealed condition, and I will make note of, as far as a bullet, the caliber, the rifling, the type of bullet that it is, and if there's any damage to it. For cartridge cases, very similarly, I'll make note of the caliber, the shape of the firing pin impression that the gun left in it, as well as the material that that cartridge case was made from. And if there are comparisons to be made, then at that time, I would continue on.
All right, so you test fire out of a particular firearm, you gather up those test fires, and then that's when we're talking about the comparison microscope, right? Where you're taking the test fire and then the evidence bullet, what was submitted to you, and you're rotating it and you're looking to see those markings. Is that right?
Initially, I would look at the tests to each other, but then yes, I would do test to evidence using the comparison microscope.
And why test to test? What's the importance of that?
I want to ensure that any markings I'm seeing left on the fired evidence reproduce from one bullet or cartridge case to the next. So to me, they're knowns. I fired them. I know they came from that same firearm. But then I need to be sure that the individual characteristics, that I can prove that based on what I'm seeing in the microscope, not just because I know I fired it, that those two bullets or those two cartridge cases were identified as being from the same firearm based on those characteristics, those individual characteristics.
Now, I've heard you refer to bullet and cartridge case. Just so we're clear, the bullet is the actual projectile that's recovered after you fire a gun, right?
Yes, and unfortunately, many people refer to the cartridge that you start with and put into the chamber of the firearm as a bullet, when in actuality, the bullet is what comes out of the barrel of the firearm.
All right. Let's talk about what you did in this case. You were submitted an item back in March of 2020. Do you recall what that item was?
I received a fired bullet.
And what was the specific date that you authored a report for this case?
I believe the report date was March 19th of 2020,
All right. And that item number, do you recall?
32.
All right. So item 32, which was a fired bullet, were you given any information about where it came from? Did it arrive with some discussion about that?
I did receive a request, an inventory form, and if I recall correctly, I believe they were asking for any information I could provide that may indicate what type of firearm fired that bullet.
All right. So take us through that examination of item 32. What did you do?
I received the evidence, as I stated, it was in a sealed condition. Upon opening it, it appeared to be in a package that may have come from a medical examiner's office.
I see.
Given that, I don't have my notes in front of me, but I most likely cleaned that bullet as a precaution if there were any biohazard material on it. And then I took the class characteristics of that bullet, and I was able to determine that it was .22 caliber. And using a known standard in the laboratory, I was able to determine that the rifling of that bullet was 16 right. So it had 16 lands and grooves with a right-hand twist. I also made note of the weight of that bullet, which I don't recall at this time. And then I went to the comparison microscope, not to do a comparison at that time, but just to get a better look at that fired bullet and to see what type of individual markings may have been left on it.
All right. So at that point, you did not have a firearm to compare that bullet to. Is that right?
There was no firearm submitted at that time for comparison, correct?
Did you conclude if that bullet could be suitable for a later comparison?
There was damage to that bullet. However, using the comparison microscope, I was able to see markings that appeared to be from individual characteristics from the gun it had been fired through. However, looking at that one bullet alone, I couldn't ensure that was the case. So my result was, maybe not word for word, but may be suitable pending the submission of additional evidence. And that basically means if I had something to compare it to, I could give you a better idea if this is worthy of a potential identification or not. So I believe my report stated may be suitable pending the submission of additional evidence.
You mentioned that the bullet was damaged. I would imagine most of the bullets that are fired through something have some type of damage to it. Is that fair?
The damage varies depending on what a bullet may have hit or gone through, and different types of bullets may get damaged in different ways.
Despite the damage you saw, at this time you still believe that there was enough there that you could make a comparison pending additional submission of evidence?
At that time, I thought there was at least enough that it was worth doing a comparison had something additional been submitted.
Were you able to determine, based on those class characteristics, the lands and grooves, what type of firearm could have fired it?
Using what's called the General Rifling Characteristics Database, referred to as a GRC, I was able to input the information that I did have into the search parameters, and I was able to pull up a list of potential firearms that could have fired that bullet. And what that means is that I told the database, the search parameters, that I had a .22 caliber bullet, that the rifling was 16 right, and then it ran through its database and pulled up, I don't recall how many different firearms at this point, but it pulled up the firearms that the database held that were .22 caliber and rifling of 16 right.
All right, may I approach, Judge? Is this the results you received when you collected that?
Yes.
All right, move to admit Exhibit 41.
Any objection? 41's admitted.
May I publish?
May.
All right, Lisa, I'm showing you Exhibit 41 here on the screen. And at the top, it's oriented a little bit. Looks like there's some search parameters you
Yes. If you move to the middle area of that sheet, you can see under caliber, I entered .22. L/groove would be land groove. I entered 16. And for twist, I entered right. Okay. So caliber, land groove, and twist.
That's the information, so that time that you had about that. And you got a list of possible types of firearms, right?
Yes.
Scroll down the list here. They're all going to be 22s.
Yes.
And they'll all have that.
Yes.
There's a variety of them. Here's on most of them are Marlins.
That is probably the most common on that list. Yes, it is the most common on that list, the manufacturer of Marlin.
This is a two-page document.
It is.
That's the bottom.
Yes.
So, fair to say there are, I don't know how many types of these guns out there in the world. I don't know, thousands, millions.
At least thousands.
It's a big pool, in other words, right?
I could agree with that, yes.
And did you provide that information to the police, the types of firearms that could have been firing that bullet?
Yes, this list was provided to the agency along with the report.
All right. What happened to that bullet after you examined it?
I repackaged it and sent it back to our property and evidence section at the lab.
All right. And that was, again, you mentioned that was in March 2020 when that report was done. Did you receive another submission to your lab that you later tested?
I did.
And what was that?
That was item 44, which was a rifle.
Okay. And do you have a report that identifies the serial number on that?
Yes, the serial number is included in the report as well as my notes.
May I approach the witness?
Yes, it is.
All right, and what's the serial number on the item number 44?
It is 011-22158.
All right, and what is that item number? Or, excuse me, what is that item?
It is a Marlin Model 60-SB 22 long rifle caliber semi-automatic rifle.
All right, did you know where that rifle came from?
It may have been listed on the request form. At this time, I don't recall.
All right, would that have been significant to you in your examination?
No.
All right, so you received that particular rifle. You already had the bullet. We talked about item 32. What did you do to see if there was a comparison?
I did have to get the bullet as well as the rifle back from the property and evidence section. Again, I made sure that things were in a sealed condition. Knowing the characteristics and already having made notes on that fired bullet, I retrieved a copy of that worksheet so I could include additional information, the fact that I had it in my possession again. I examined the firearm as I stated how I would earlier, making note of the make, model, serial number, and the other characteristics of it. In this case, it did appear to be in proper working order. Safety's functioned, and I did go ahead and test fire this rifle with ammunition from the laboratory stock.
Now, was it important that you use the same type of ammunition that the evidence bullet was?
It's best to use something as similar as possible to your evidence type, to your type of evidence that you've received.
All right. And let's start with the obvious. What did you see from those test fires about the class characteristics of that particular firearm?
Even by just looking at the firearm itself, as well as looking at the test fires, I was able to determine that the rifle had rifling of 16 right.
All right. And that Marlin that we talked about, the evidence of firearm, that was included in that list that we talked about in Exhibit 41.
This make and model was included, yes.
All right.
Mr. Barker, I hate to interrupt, but it's noon. It's a good time to take our lunch break.
That would be fine. Thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I want you to have your lunch. So remember the admonition. Do not talk to anyone about the case. Do not let anyone talk to you about it. That includes each other. Keep an open mind, please, about the case, and do not form any opinions about the case. So if you could be back, normal schedule, if you could be back as I've been asking you to, and I sure appreciate that you've been doing it, is be back in the jury room by 1:20-ish, so that you're ready to go, so we can try to call for you as close to 1:30 as possible. Enjoy your lunch hour. Recess. We stand in recess. Please be seated. And counsel, anything you put on the record before we take our recess? Okay, and then if you could be back between, I would say about 1:15, 1:20, so if you have to put anything on the record, we've got time to do it. All right, we stand in recess and you can step down. Thank you.